We are recording, awesome. So just want to officially welcome everybody to the second installment of our voter education series. And so the Alpha Epsilon Omega alumni chapter of Iota Phi Theta Fraternity Incorporated, along with the North Carolina Black Alliance, we've launched this 5-part virtual voter education series to increase voter literacy among unrepresented communities ahead of the November election. This effort allows Black people and other people of color to have a better understanding of the impact of their vote. And so in short, I'm sure all of us have been beaten over the head growing up about voting, saying that our ancestors died for us to vote, but may not necessarily have a complete understanding of what our vote actually means or does, or the impact of our vote. And so this series helps to decipher that a little bit. And tonight, I have the distinct pleasure of introducing Dawn Blagrove. And so Dawn is an attorney and a very proud graduate of FAMU and North Carolina Central School of Law. At FAM, she obtained her Bachelor of Science in Political Science with a minor in secondary education, and she also earned her master's degree in Applied Social Science. After finishing law school at NC Central, Dawn worked for 8 years as a post-conviction staff attorney with North Carolina Prisoner Legal Services, where she co-managed the jail credit team of 5 paralegals dedicated to jail credit issues. Today, her experience as a post-conviction attorney, combined with her undergraduate training and secondary education, fuels her passion for working with youth and teaching others about challenges in the criminal justice system as the executive director of Emancipate NC. And because Dawn doesn't have enough to do, she also serves as an adjunct professor at the Criminal Justice Department at Fayetteville Tech. And so I turn the program over to you, Dawn. And again, thank you for taking time to talk with us.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you guys for having me. We have a bunch to cover, so let's jump right in. I'm going to start sharing my screen because I have some slides. You all, let me just lay a little bit of groundwork. I'm not sure who's here with us, but shoot me questions in the text or in the chat. Yes. I don't know if you can, just shoot me questions in the chat if you can. If not, I don't know, are we streaming live on Facebook or anything else?
No, just,
right.
And also there's a little bit of feedback coming from you.
Oh, okay.
Don't know. Like it wasn't there before, or we were talking before everything started. So, so you bring up a good point. If you guys have questions, do put them in the chat and we will stop during the presentation to take questions. And we'll also do a Q&A at the end as well. And just to let you guys know, this session will also be posted to triangleiotas.org within the next day or two.
All right, let's jump right in, folks. All right. So, what we're going to be talking about today is the Electoral College and how and why it works the way it works. So, what is the Electoral College? It is a body of people representing the states of the United States who formally cast votes for the election of the president and the vice president. Electoral College consists of 538 electorates across the country. A majority of 270 electorate votes is required to elect the president. And each state has the same number of electors as it does members in its congressional delegation. So that means 1 for each member in the House of Representatives, plus 2 senators. So we're gonna watch a short video about the Electoral College that's gonna give everybody a primer, okay?
What is the Electoral College? In a nutshell, it is a layer of bureaucracy.
Dawn, if you could turn the volume up on the video, if you can.
Sorry, hold on, guys. I'll start it over and turn the volume up. Hold on a second. And I thought I was being so fancy with my little video, y'all. Hold on. All right, let's try that again. There we go.
What is
A little better?
Actually, it started fine and then it faded out. Like right now, I don't know about everybody else, but I can't really hear anything.
Okay. All right, y'all let me know. Can you, let's see, let me stop sharing my screen for a second. Can they text no sound from the video? So nobody's getting sound?
No.
Okay, then never mind, we'll skip it. All right, we don't really need it. All right, so let's jump right in then. So the Electoral College, the words Electoral College actually do not appear in the United States Constitution. But it is definitely created by a constitutional article, Article 2, Section 1, which reads, the number of electors equal to the whole number of senators and representatives to which a state may be entitled in Congress, that this is the group of people who will determine who becomes the president of the United States, president and vice president, but president of the United States. So why do we have an electoral college? So history books will tell you that our founding fathers feared that there would be factions and worried that voters wouldn't make informed decisions. Essentially, they were afraid that regular people would screw it up. So they wanted a second layer to the electoral process to ensure that if the people used their vote in a way that went off the rails, that there was this other kind of safety net to ensure that the country didn't elect a dictator or a tyrant or something like that. You'll also see in history books that they feared that states with the largest voting populations would essentially end up choosing the president. So if you do not have this way of this electoral college, which is essentially a way to give every state, or at least to try to balance the power of each state. So it's not just made up of sheer numbers. It's not just a numbers game. In order to make sure that everyone was fairly represented, this was the compromise that our founding fathers came up with. Now, in reality, what this was about was slave states, okay? Because when our Constitution was initially drafted, obviously, chattel slavery was still a part of our country, strong part of our country, part of our economic DNA. And in southern states, where they were slave states, because they were so heavily populated by enslaved people, who were not given, obviously, the right to vote, southern states were concerned that if it was purely a numbers game for elections, that they would never get a candidate that they wanted elected. So there was a compromise made. Very often we hear the term, we talk about 3/5, how enslaved people were considered 3/5 of a person in our US Constitution. The reason for that, you can thank the Electoral College for why we were deemed to be 3/5 of people in the US Constitution. And it was because of voting power. Because if your southern states are grossly populated by enslaved people who are disenfranchised and do not have the right to vote, then that is a numbers game that you always lose. So the compromise was, we will make this electoral college that will help even out that numbers game a little bit to make sure that every state has some say in who is elected president of the United States. And then the 3/5 compromise was made so that the southern states could kind of boost their numbers. So just to recap, the reason that we have the Electoral College essentially is because it was a compromise. And the compromise was needed because southern states were afraid of losing the numbers game in elections, because their states were so heavily populated by enslaved Africans who not only were not allowed to vote, but also initially were not counted as citizens of those states, okay? So the 3/5 clause helps them because the number of electorates you have per state is determined by your population, right? Determined by your population. So those southern states needed to count those enslaved Black folks so that they could get their numbers up. But because they couldn't vote, the compromise was we would only count each as 3/5 of a person. But even at 3/5 in the southern states, because of the number of enslaved people that were fueling the economy, it helped them create a balance of power that made those southern slave owners feel more secure. So that is why we have our electoral college. Are there any questions about that particular piece? Because it's kind of a big piece. That gives you, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, so there are no questions that I see so far, but if you guys have questions, please put them in the chat. There's a Q&A section for your questions, and when I see your questions, we will have them answered.
Awesome. Okay, so now that we understand what it is, we understand why we have it, essentially, or at least the rationale behind it. Let's talk a little bit more about who our electors are in North Carolina. So in North Carolina, or in every state for that matter, each party in a statewide convention nominates, well, in North Carolina, it's only 15. It'll vary depending on state to state. But each party picks the total number of electorates that state is entitled to have. So in North Carolina, we pick 15, and then there are 2 alternates, okay? Now, because you don't know which party is going to win, because you don't know which party is going to win the popular vote, both parties in North Carolina would both have these 15 folks, 15 electorates, okay? So there are 15 Democratic electors, there are 15 Republican. If there is an independent party or an independent candidate or a third party candidate, then that third party would also be able to, if they don't have a convention, they would also be allowed to go about however they would go about selecting their delegation in the event that their third party candidate was the one who received the majority of the votes in the state. I don't think we have had a national third party candidate since 92, maybe.
Is that Ross Perot?
I think Ross Perot was the last third party that made it all the way to the general.
Can't believe I remember that.
Yeah, Ross Perot was the last one. It was pretty. I remember it because it was the first year that I could vote. It was the most awesome presidential election ever. It was so fantastic. If you don't remember Ross Perot, he died recently. If you don't remember him, look him up. Just Google some of his speeches. It was fantastic. Anyway, it made for great TV. So anyways, back to the Electoral College. So each party has this set of folks that they have on standby, okay? So what happens then is this. each of us have, as an individual citizen who has the right to vote, has an individual right to vote. So we cast our votes in presidential elections for whichever candidate we believe in, or whichever is the lesser of the two evils, whatever the case may be, right? And so often you'll hear people talk about the Electoral College and say that, well, because of the Electoral College, the people don't elect the president. And that is true technically, but in practice, not really. So let's jump into it. So when you are voting, technically, you are not casting your vote for a presidential candidate. You are casting your vote for the electorate who represents your party in your district. Okay, let me say it again. You are casting your vote, in essence, for the person who will sit on the Electoral College and represent you. That's what you're doing. Who's gonna go? So who from my district and who from my state is gonna go? Is it gonna be somebody from the Democratic Party, or is it gonna be somebody from the Republican Party? That's what your vote is doing, okay? And in theory, it could be different, right? There could be, there have been times when, throughout the course of American history, when there have been three strong parties, or even more. We have not had a presidential election with more than 3 candidates, I don't think, in probably 300 or 400 years. It's been a really long time. But again, and we haven't had one with a third party candidate on the national level since Ross Perot, since '92. So that is not something that happens frequently, but it could happen, okay? So when you cast your vote again, you have the choice between casting your vote for the Republican candidate or casting your vote for the Democratic candidate. And what you're actually doing is voting not directly for the candidate, but you are voting for which electorate will go to the Electoral College on behalf of you, all right? So as election results are certified by the state, the governor notifies the set of electors that got the most votes to meet to cast their college vote, okay? So what does that mean? That means once all of the votes are cast in North Carolina, once all of those elections in all 100 counties are certified, then we know which candidate got the most votes. And it takes about 10 days to certify the election, and then the governor will issue a summons of sorts for these folks from the Electoral College to come. All of them will come to North Carolina, whomever it is, whichever party candidate got the most votes, so Democratic or Republican. So one set of those electorates are going to come to Raleigh, and they are going to sit in the old Capitol building, and they are going to vote. You have a right to watch that if you want to. You can't sit in the room because it's super small. I don't know if you've ever been to the old Capitol building, but it's crazy tiny. But they broadcast it live, and you can watch it. You can listen to it. There's audio available if you want to. It's not really that exciting, and we'll talk about it why, because they don't really have much choice as to what they do with their vote. In North Carolina, there is already a law on the books that says all of our votes, all of our electors have to cast their vote for the person who got the most popular votes in the state. They have to. They all do. Okay.
So there is a question, and I believe you're probably going to get to this later in your presentation. The question is, has changing this ever been discussed to just count the popular vote?
Yeah, it's discussed all the time, and we can do it now. Yeah, it's talked about all the time, but there are pros and cons to that. And actually, the system that we have right now, in theory, right, is based on the popular vote. The problem, though, with doing it straight popular vote is that that our vote as Black folks, then this is my concern. My concern is that our vote gets so diluted because we are such a small population of the country, because we only make up 14%, and we're only in places, we're largely congregated in certain urban areas, right? I mean, we exist all over, but you know what I mean. We're largely located in certain urban areas. What happens with the Electoral College, if with just using a popular vote, is that there will be candidates who have no real incentive to talk about issues that are important to us, because without that Electoral College and without us being able to control the votes, or at least to swing the popular votes in a number of different states, we don't have the numbers to affect the outcome of elections in theory, okay? However, in states where we are grossly, where we make up large swaths of those states of the population, and because of the Electoral College, because each state has a proportionate number of electors that they can send to the Electoral College, our issues are given greater weight. So I personally think that the Electoral College works in our benefit as Black folks. Now, I think it's a racist system, and the way we got here is racist as hell. But the reality is that without it, there is a very strong possibility that politics skews so far, or that because we do not make up the majority of the country, if all we're talking about is popular votes, then there is no real incentive for any candidate to consider our individual or our collective issues as Black folks. So that is my thing, but again, there are very, very, very smart people disagree vehemently with me on that issue, and that is completely okay, because great minds can disagree. But I personally am someone who believes that doing away with the Electoral College will hurt us politically, and hurt us socially.
So we just got another question, and the question is about last week's Supreme Court decision.
We'll get there. Okay, we'll get there.
So we're gonna get there. Okay, so we are.
But again, so here's the important thing that I want to talk about. Everybody on this call needs to complete their census. If you have not completed your census, I need you to complete that census, because it matters in so many different ways. But one of the ways that it matters is that it determines how many electorates we get as a state, okay? If you don't fill out that census, there's a strong chance that we lose the number of, that we may lose a delegate, right? Or not a delegate, excuse me, we may lose electorates, or we may pick up electorates. Filling out the census is incredibly important. So again, as we're coming up in this election year, if everybody remembers all of the talk that we heard about whether or not we were going to include undocumented folks on the census, and if we were, all of that conversation is so deeply rooted in the 3/5 compromise that we talked about, and how you count those people and what that does to your level of representation as a state, with determining who becomes the next president. Make no mistake, when you hear folks talk about the census, and when you hear folks talk about, and at this point, we're counting everyone, the attempts to not include undocumented folks was successfully squashed, but that is the reason behind it, is because it is a numbers game. And if you can make sure that there are enough people working, especially in strongly agricultural states like North Carolina, like Florida, where these folks are, California, where these folks are working and they're migrant workers and they're moving around. If you don't have to count those folks, then what happens is that you don't change your delegate numbers, you don't change your census, you don't change your electoral numbers, right? But if you do count them, even though they can't vote, what could happen is you end up with a higher representation or an inflated representation from some states that does not actually reflect the people who can vote, okay? Like our, i.e. the 3/5 thing, right? So the census matters. If you haven't filled it, it matters for a whole bunch of reasons, but it just, in this context, it matters as well. So if you haven't done it, do it, it's important, okay?
So, and just real quick on that, as a matter of fact, our session last week about gerrymandering, we spent a good part of the discussion talking about the census and how when you look at gerrymandering and you look at sort of how communities are represented, it all starts with the census. So the census is extremely important.
It is incredibly important.
Quick plug, if you guys haven't completed the census, please do so. You can do that online. Also, I know it might be a little weird putting up a Facebook post asking you people to complete the census, but that might actually not be a bad idea, because as you see, this is another example of what the census can do to communities, especially our communities. So.
That's exactly right. All right, so how does Electoral College work? So again, we just went through the North Carolina electorates and how they become electorates. They get elected at their conventions. And I mean, screw it. So most of these people are so heavily, deeply involved in politics and in their party that you probably won't know them. They aren't folks that, I mean, it's not like the Electoral College is made up of people that are everyday people. They don't represent those of us, they don't represent your average Joe. They are people in both parties, the people who get to, because it's a highly coveted position, even though it doesn't really do anything within political circles. It is a big deal. They lobby very hard for these to become these electors. It's a big deal for them. One of the biggest, I tell you, I've benefited, my family and I benefited when Obama won when he won the first time in 2008. My husband worked with this Black woman who was a Republican, but she was also one of the electors. And because of that, they get special seating. They get very privileged seating at the, all of them, no matter what party you're from. They all get very, very privileged seating at the inauguration. And so because she was not interested in seeing Barack Obama be inaugurated, she got tickets and she shared them with us because she didn't want to go. So we were able to have really good seating at the first one because she had these tickets and she didn't want to go. But anyways, so how does Electoral College work? So all of these people who are selected from each state meet just like I just described. That happens in North Carolina, where they go to the old Capitol building and they sit in a room together and they cast their vote for whomever won the popular vote in the state. All of the votes in the state cast by the people are counted to determine which electoral will get to cast your vote. So this is where it gets a little weird. The electors of each state then cast their vote for president based on which candidate got the majority of the popular vote, okay? In North Carolina, like most countries like most states in the country, you do not have a choice. Those folks do not have a choice. Like, they cannot get in there and say, you know what, I know I pledged my delegate vote to the Democratic candidate, but I don't want to vote for that person anymore. So then one of our 15 votes would go for the other guy or the other girl or whoever this person decided to cast their vote for. Because in theory, it doesn't have to be one of the two, even has to be one of the two people who are representing each party. for example, in the lawsuit that we'll get to a little bit that the Supreme Court just ruled, there were several people who cast their votes. One guy cast his vote for Koch, what's the guy name? What was the guy's name?
I think it was Powell.
Who was it?
What do you think?
In the last president, in the 2016 election, they tried to cast their vote for people other than Donald Trump, okay? Right. Or other than Hillary Clinton, and that attempt was thwarted, and they sued, and those lawsuits went up to the Supreme Court. That's how the Supreme Court was able to decide last week about this particular issue. But anyways, most states have laws on the book that says whoever wins, whichever party wins the popular vote, all of their electoral college votes go to that individual. Okay. A candidate again has to get 270 votes in order to secure the bag and become the president of the United States. All right. So why are people mad about this? Why don't people like this process? And we talked about it a little bit already. Most people's objection to the Electoral College comes from basically a fundamental lack of understanding about how it works. These folks do not have the ability to just go straight rogue and, create some kind of coup about electing a president that is not the president or not the person that got the most popular votes in their state. They just can't do that. But in theory, they could, up until last week. In theory, because it had never been decided and because it's not specifically stated in the Constitution one way or the other, the power of these electors, it had to be decided by the Supreme Court, because that's what they do. They decide questions of constitutionality. So in theory, let's say you're writing a political novel, and in theory, some crazy villain who's super rich finds out who all the electors are all over the country and pays each of them $1 million to secretly cast their electorate vote for him. Okay, so that in the they all pledge to their respective parties, but then when they get in to vote, to cast their actual electoral vote, they vote for him because he's paid them. Now that's never happened, but in theory, it could have, right? And if it happened, that person would then be elected president of the United States. That could happen. That's a thing. So these people could go rogue in theory now, but it would have to be enough. He would have to put out a lot of money to pay and it wouldn't have to just be 270. It would have to be twice that number, because this villain wouldn't know which party was going to get the popular votes, right, in each state. So he would have to pay off a lot of people, but it could be done, right?
Gee, I wonder how many people have $500 million waiting around.
I'm just saying. Listen, and let me be clear. Let me say also, I don't have any proprietary ownership over that story. So if there are authors or screenwriters on this call, feel free to run with that. Anyways, so that could happen. But it's never happened. It has never happened. And actually, never in the history of the Electoral College has there ever been a time when some rogue faction of the electorates cast their vote in a way that changed the outcome of the election. Okay, it just doesn't happen. Not that it can't happen. Well, it can't happen now, but it just doesn't happen. It's never happened. It is a concept that exists in theory alone, but not in practice. Okay, so what happened? What did the Supreme Court case do? What the Supreme Court case does, in essence, is cut off the possibility for the rogue elector to sway the outcome of a presidential election, okay? So what the Supreme Court said was this: it is not unconstitutional for states to tell you as electors who you can cast your vote for. If you are an electoral for the Democratic Party, you have got, and the Democratic Party wins the popular vote, you have got to cast your vote for the person who the Democratic Party selected as their nominee. You have to. You do not have a choice. Okay. Like I said, in two cases, so this case, oftentimes the Supreme Court will rule on one case, and you'll be like, the Supreme Court ruled on a case. In this instance, and that's not, most of the time, that's not true. Most of the time, it's multiple cases that they combine together. In this case, it was two cases that were brought up, one from Washington, one from Colorado, from two folks, two disgruntled electorals who did not, for whatever reason, want to cast their votes for Hillary Clinton in the 2016 election. And one of them was thwarted early on. They were removed and fined. The other one was allowed to cast his vote for whomever, I can't remember who it was that he wanted to vote for. But both of them sued irrespectively to say that it was unconstitutional for the state to tell them as designated electors how they had to cast their vote in Electoral College. Okay. And what the Supreme Court said was, that's crazy. You don't really have, this vote that you're casting isn't really yours. It is the vote of the people. And the people voted in a particular way. And so you have got to do the will of the people, period. You don't get to go rogue. That is not okay. All right. So that's what the Supreme Court case says. Are there any questions about that?
There are no new questions at the moment.
Okay. So if you don't know anything about if this is really a 101 for you, the question that I know should be burning is, if the Electoral College casts its votes based on the popular vote, how is it that people win the popular vote and lose the Electoral College vote?
Gee, I wonder when that happened.
How does that happen? All right, let me explain it to you. So how that happens is this. Oh, and also, I want to talk a little bit about, if you're like me, most people aren't, but if you are, you sit up all night, and it appears that CNN knows, they know who the president is. I mean, except for, but it took us months with Bush v. Gore, right? Months to find out who the president was, hanging chads and all that foolishness. But most of the time, they can fairly predict who is going to win the election on election night, right? Despite the fact that they don't have, despite the fact that these electoral colleges have not met and have not cast their votes. How can that be? So it's because of the popular vote, right? Because we know what the popular vote is in each individual state. The problem is that there are states that have teeny tiny populations, because there's no state in the entire country that doesn't have at least 3 electoral votes in the Electoral College, okay? That is the least number you can have. It doesn't matter what your state population is, the least number you can have is 3. Nobody can have less than 3, okay? So because there are places where people get electoral college votes where the population is very, very small, Wyoming, North Dakota, those kind of places where there's just aren't a lot of people, they just don't have high density of population, they still get these 2 from the Senate and at least 1 based on their population, okay? And that is how your electoral college can sometimes give you a winner that did not win the popular vote throughout the entire country, because the population of the country is not evenly dispersed, right? So you have a place like California that is like a small country by itself that has so many electorates and has so many votes in the Electoral College, right? And that's great. But you also know that by the time we get to California, most of the time, what do we know? The election's already decided. CNN had already called it before California even gets in. It's because of all those smaller states that make up the vast majority of the country, those middle states, right? But that is because large pockets of the population are not in those middle states, but they still get at least 3 electoral votes. You only need 200, and you only need 270 to win.
So I don't know if you guys noticed this with the flyer for tonight's discussion. If you saw the numbers that outline pretty much the content of the 48 states, each number is the amount of electoral votes that each state gets. And so you notice how California has 55, Texas I think has like 38, New York and Florida I think has like 28, Illinois has 20. I know this because I created the flyer, I had to look all this stuff up. So if you just look at the flyer for tonight's program, you can see how many electoral votes each state gets. But we do have one quick question. And okay. So with the Supreme Court decision, it is against the law for an electorate to vote against their respective state's popular vote.
Okay, that's a good question. No, it is not. What this court decision does is say that if, like the vast majority of the states in the country, you have a law on the books that says it is against the law to cast your vote other than what matches the popular vote, that law is constitutional and can be upheld. So, yeah. So the Supreme Court doesn't make law. It's kind of a nuanced, weird, tricky thing. So it can't say it is against the law for you to do this, it's against the law to do that. But it can't say it is unconstitutional for you to do this, it is unconstitutional for you to do that, or it is constitutional, which means it's okay. So what this ruling says is it is absolutely constitutional for a state to tell its electoral college that you must vote for the person who received the largest number of popular vote in our state. Does that make sense? And most states, like I said, everyone except for Maine and Nebraska have laws like that on the books. So if you live in Maine or Nebraska, technically you can still cast your vote for whoever you want to. But because we know, I mean, you can look at the flyer and you see that Maine and Nebraska are not going to be game changers for anybody. And no. the vast majority of the people who make up the Electoral College, even in Maine and Nebraska, are always going to vote with the popular vote of their state. Like it just doesn't happen that people deviate. Like it does, but it isn't. I mean, small numbers. I think the 2016 election might have had the largest number of folks who tried to cast their votes for people other than the person who got the popular vote in their state, and I think it was like 6 of them, I think. So it doesn't happen that often, and the threat of it is smaller. But going into this election, right, it mattered because folks are desperate right now, right? Like we don't want, I'm gonna tell you right now, if I had an electorate vote for North Carolina and Trump won North Carolina, I would be highly tempted to stage a coup, right? If I could. Now, what the Supreme Court is doing is saying, we get that that could be a real possibility. And in order to create stability, now is the time for us to nail down what is constitutional and what is not. So by nailing it down, going into this November election, what they do is what they're doing is trying to stop the chaos that could, and I think there's a high probability would likely ensue if the electoral delegates could go rogue without consequence. Right now, they could go rogue, but they can't go rogue without consequence. Does that answer the question?
I believe so.
Okay. I think you guys, we're done. So that's all I have. This is my contact information. If you have questions or concerns, oh wait, there's some stuff. What's going on in the chat? If you have questions or concerns, you can feel free to reach out to me directly. This is my contact information. And if you have issues or questions about any other any criminal justice issue, which is what I do mostly, feel free to reach out to us. We do trainings just like these all over the place. So if you enjoyed this one, I've got a whole bunch of them that I can do for you related to criminal justice, reforms, police abolition, things like that. So thank you for giving me your time this evening. I hope you enjoyed it and I hope you learned something.
Dawn, thank you. We greatly appreciate this. You know, I'm someone who likes to think knows a lot of things, but I've learned through your presentation. So greatly appreciate that. So a few shameless plugs. This presentation will be on the triangleiotas.org website within the next few days. Our next workshop isn't till August, and our conversation then is going to focus on how do you make your vote count. After that, in September, we are going to talk about how you can be an informed voter. And what I think will be a hot topic for October is, what are your rights on election day? Even in primaries across the country, there have already been issues. Polling places shut down, closed early. It's things like that.
Yeah. I grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Milwaukee, which is the highest populated state in Wisconsin, had 3 polling places open for the primary election.
I think Louisville, the city of Louisville, Kentucky, had 1. And the city of Louisville has, I think, over 600,000 people. And of course, like you alluded to earlier, Black people are mostly concentrated in your most urban areas. And so you look at that and you say, a city of, imagine, for those in North Carolina, imagine if Raleigh had 1 polling place or 2. It would be maddening. So I'm sure that conversation is going to be a very, very good one. But for those in North Carolina, and I do see, I think there is a question. Let me click down. Nope, just a thank you. For those in North Carolina, if you go to triangleiotas.org/time-to-build, or just go to triangleiotas.org, we do have a page for Q&A, for FAQs on North Carolina voting. And so this is going to be another hot issue, but you can vote by mail in North Carolina, and you do not need a particular excuse to do so. You can, there's a link to the form where you can request to do so on our website. There's also questions about voter ID. Spoiler alert, you do not need an ID to vote in North Carolina. You're probably going to hear that, but you do not need an ID to vote in North Carolina, as well as other questions. And let's see, we do have one more question. I can't remember the name of it right now, but I've heard of a compact certain states are promoting and passing to agree to make their state electors vote according to the national popular vote. It's called the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact.
So so that's also one of the things that spurred the Supreme Court to take up this question, because they the Supreme Court take up whatever question they want to. They don't have to take any cases if they don't want to. But this would be what the Supreme Court case does for this interstate compact is squash it, right? Because unless the states, like I said, the only two states that give their Electoral College members the autonomy to vote otherwise are Maine and Nebraska. Everyone else has to go with the popular vote of their state. This interstate compact can't work unless each one of those states, or all of the states for that matter, or whichever states enter this compact, rescind the laws that they have on the books that require their electoral delegates to cast their vote for the popular vote in the state. So, yeah, and even still, like that's the only way it can happen now based on the Supreme Court case. Now, before the Supreme Court case, right, even if you had a law on the books that said that you had to cast your vote a certain way, as long as you were willing to deal with the consequences that came with that, or you were going to challenge that to challenge the constitutionality of a law like that. But now that that law is constitutional, those types of laws have been deemed constitutional, there are no real challenges to get around them. So short of repealing them in every state, this interstate compact to use the popular vote from the country is dead in the water.
All right, thank you for that. That is our last question. So again, to everyone, thank you for taking the time. Hopefully, I'm sure all of you have learned something. I know I did. And again, Dawn, thank you for taking the time to educate us.
My pleasure.
And we will see all of you next month. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for
Have a good
having me.
evening and stay safe.